To a truly extraordinary scientist. But before I do that, before I introduce Denis, I just want to give you a bit background. He works at an institute called DLR, and at that institute he works really closely with a guy called Franz Trieb. And Franz Trieb is considered to be one of the fathers of desert energy, which is also often referred to as desertec. And this is an initiative that the German Chancellor Angela Merkel once compared to the moon landing because it's so incredibly ambitious and has quite a potential to transform how we get energy around the world. Has any one of you ever heard of the Noor energy plant? Who's heard of Noor? You want to quickly tell us what it's about?
It was just finished this year and it's I think one of the biggest desert solar power plants in the world.
Exactly. Noor is the biggest desert solar plant in the world. It's in Morocco. Noor is actually Arabic and means light, and it was built by the Moroccan government, and it currently has a capacity of about 500 megawatts. And when it's completed, which is supposed to be in 2020, it will have a capacity of 2 gigawatts, which is about double as much as one nuclear power plant. And when they started construction in 2010, Morocco imported 97% of all their electricity. And almost all of that was based on fossil fuels, so dirty electricity. But as soon as this is completed, so 10 years after they started in 2020, Morocco will gain 47% of all their power from that one power plant, and thus have more renewable energy within 10 years than Germany has managed to gain as a percentage in the last decades. And Germany is often hailed as quite an ambassador for renewable energy. And this is all part of this initiative, this desertec initiative. And I want to give you a bit of that story before Denis takes over, because I think it's quite interesting and could teach us a lot for all of our activist projects. Because it also has a story of industry sabotage. This initiative was originally kicked off by the Club of Rome, and it was spun into a separate company called the Desertec project. But then some of the German energy providers were afraid that they could lose market share because of this new project. And they tried to kill it, and to do that, what they said is, if you can't beat it, join it. And they became a part of that project, gained very influential positions within the project. And from that position, what they tried to do, or what they effectively did, was they created studies that came to conclusions like it's incredibly expensive and it can only work in decades from now. And through these studies, they managed to quite effectively change public perception against that initiative and essentially destroy that project. But what's happening now is that the Club of Rome handed over the responsibility of that project to us children and youth at Plant for the Planet. And we're now taking responsibility of this and sharing an office with the Desertec Foundation and trying to give it new life and work with people like Denis to restart it. And obviously, if we want to do something like that, we can't just talk the talk, we also need to walk the walk. And as part of that, the office that we are hosting this in, the Plant for the Planet office and the Desertec office, is this train station. And obviously it's very important that we have our office in the train station so we can use public transport. But this is actually a rather special train station because it's the first plus energy train station in Germany and probably in the world, because we put solar energy on the top, on the roof, solar thermal and photovoltaic solar energy. We've also put a geothermal energy system in the ground. We also obviously insulated the entire building. We put a big battery in the cellar, in the basement, so we can store our power. And we're also providing free electricity to all electric cars that want to charge there. So that's our office of the new Desertec Foundation and Plant for the Planet. And I think it's quite an authentic place to host such an initiative. And Denis himself has made quite an incredible contribution to this vision of the Desertec initiative. And he's going to tell us far more about that in just a minute. And what he is doing is essentially pioneering quite a fantastic idea. Because what most of you, or some of you, especially the Germans, will know is that we have lots of nuclear power plants within Germany that are being shut down in the next couple of years. And because of that, we will have a lot of energy grids that radiate out from these power plants that will no longer be used. And Denis came up with an ingenious way how to use these grids that already exist and to use them to get cheapest possible nuclear energy. And I think that's quite fantastic. And one of the most beautiful ways to describe this Desertec initiative is what the famous German consultant Roland Berger once said about it. What he said is that the steam engine gave wealth to 1 billion people, and what the Desertec vision could do is give clean wealth to 7 billion people and make those first billion people clean. And that's the general idea, it's the goal behind this wonderful project of getting electricity from the world's deserts all around the world. Now there's some nasty arguments that have been made against this vision to destroy this, and we're trying our best to debunk it. One of these nasty arguments that have been made is this idea that we've colonized Africa for 500 years, and now we're trying to steal their sun as well, which is a common argument that you might read in the news in a couple of countries. Obviously, it makes very little sense, especially if you actually look at these projects. For instance, what the Noor project in Morocco did is they didn't just export electricity. So what they are doing is they build electricity for the local population. Only in the second step, what they would want to do, and their aspiration is to then export that electricity into the West. The problem is that they're currently not able to do that. They're currently not allowed, because of government regulation in Europe, to export electricity to Europe. So it's a total opposite. What we need to do is allow these countries to export their electricity so they can have the economic benefit of exporting to Europe, and by allowing this kind of trade. And the second argument that is often made against this Desertec vision is that renewable energy is about decentralization, right? That the great benefit of renewable energy is that we can decentralize have our own systems instead of relying on big providers. And that's a very good point. That is a wonderful benefit of a lot of renewable energy systems. But two things that have to be understood is that obviously these Desertec projects, there can be thousands of them all around the world. So it's not one centralized system, but thousands of small ones. And the second point that I would make here is that we are in a situation with catastrophic climate change that we have to address as soon as possible. And that means that we have to truly evaluate all the possible solutions to the climate crisis, right? And all the possible solutions of creating green energy. And that's why we should definitely also consider the Desertec project as one of them. So we're now going to hear from Denis about the scientific background of this wonderful vision. And if any one of you wants to join us in trying to make this happen and trying to allow these countries to export their energy into Europe, then please talk to me afterwards and we can chat about how you can join our effort. And we also brought a few red books, the Desertec books. They're right there at the door. They'll give you a lot more background and you can read more. This is actually just the introduction, not the speech, but we can have questions too.
Just open the window.
Oh, okay, sure. Good idea. Sure. So, thank you. And I think I've said more than enough. So now I'd like to hand over to Denis.
Yes, thank you really much. Thank you, Felix, for this introduction and for inviting me here to COY13 here in Bonn this year. I would like to take you now to a virtual journey to the world's desert, and therefore I will take you to the background of the a project which can provide energy from desert areas, clean energy like coal and nuclear power plants. What we see here is the world at night and the centers of demand here in the yellow areas. There people consume all over the year energy for heating homes, electricity, driving by car, and these are the demand centers which are currently supplied by nuclear and coal-fired power plants and some kind of small renewable energy shares. But for climate change reasons and cost reasons, we have to decarbonize our electricity system. And the desert areas, which can be seen here in the red areas, can supply so-called dispatchable energy. But what is dispatchable energy? It is energy around the clock, day and night. And this is possible by so-called concentrating solar power plants, which Felix already mentioned. These power plants can use direct sunlight and convert this direct sunlight into heat and functionate like a coal and nuclear power plant station. This energy is only available in these red areas. For example, Europe hasn't got this high potential like in the North African and Middle East area. Therefore, one option could be a cooperation between Europe and North Africa and Middle East. We call this area the EU-MENA area. This area, like also in North Africa and Middle East, needs energy, water, food, labor and income for further 300 million people in the year 2050. And what is the solution for covering these needs, these human needs in these desert areas? One solution could be, of course, as we see today, that refugees come over the sea and want to live in Europe because in North Africa there is no living area. But this couldn't be the solution for a long time. Desert area can be fulfilled with new living area that can provide energy with concentrating solar power or photovoltaic, and be just one step to renaturate this area, building agricultural areas, new trees, and also oases to live in, to export not only electricity but nutrition like tomatoes, salad, and sustainable water supply from desalination plants from the sea here. But how do such concentrating solar power plants work? Such concentrating solar power plants, like here, as you can see in California, they are built in the year 2014, Ivanpah, with about 400 megawatt. These are solar tower configurations. Solar tower configurations collect the direct sunlight and focus on a tower where a medium is heated and drives a steam cycle for using energy like a steam cycle in a coal or nuclear power plant. But here, just without any coal or nuclear fuels, these power plants are just carbon neutral. Or, as you can see here, a parabolic draft configuration of such a concentrating solar power plant. It collects direct sunlight in a parabolic mirror and focuses on a heat pipe, which also drives a steam cycle, like, as I already told, like a coal-fired power plant. And the last configuration is the linear Fresnel technology. It's comparable like the parabolic draft configuration, and it also focuses with the mirrors on a heat pipe which heats a medium for a steam cycle. For a steam cycle. This power plant is just building in northeastern of India. So I already mentioned some principle of this solar thermal power plant, and it can be explained that it uses direct sunlight, which is collected, focused on a heat pipe, which is either directly turned to a steam turbine and via a generator, then electricity is generated, or to a thermal storage that also the steam turbine can functionate during night. In any case, we can use also co-firing in some hours of the year, less than 10 or 15 hours, by biomass, that it can just seen as a power plant which is functioning all day and all year long, constantly available. In Europe, also potentials of concentrating solar power plants are possible, but in North Africa, the constant available sunlight is just more efficient to drive such power plants than in Europe. Also in Europe, just the surface is conflicted by agricultural use, and in North Africa, no of the desert areas are used. Therefore, it can also be exported, this energy, via high voltage direct current lines. This technology just allows to export via a really long transmission with low transmission losses. Here, for example, a configuration is shown which is built in Morocco, and it exports via this transmission line directly to a German consumption center, for example, like in Bonn or Frankfurt or Berlin or Munich. And this configuration allows the German energy transition to use such energy, which is available around the clock, to substitute just home nuclear and coal-fired power plants to economic price. But how can such concentrating solar power plants enable agricultural use in the desert areas where the sun is really strength and just destruct many of the sensible flowers or vegetables? One solution can be the configuration of the linear Fresnel technology, which is seen here, and underneath sensible fruits or flowers can grow to feed local population, but also for an export to Europe or other countries worldwide. So we can make arable land just usable with concentrating solar power plants that protect sensible vegetables or plants in general. One of the projects is the Sahara Forest project. It just analyzes with certain feasibility studies the value of building concentrating solar power here, combined with photovoltaics and trees. Trees are very important in Sahara areas just to protect other plants by building shadow, but also just to strengthen the underground, which is not very strengthened yet due to the desert area in North Africa. The DLR, the German Aerospace Center, did in the last years many research on CSP integration, concentrating solar power integration in Europe, Middle East and North Africa. Starting with 2003, the Trans-Mediterranean Renewable Energy Cooperative, the TREC, was founded. Then we did some export possibilities to export solar electricity from North Africa and Middle East to Europe via point-to-point connection lines. Then European projects took place, scientific analysis took place, diploma thesis of mine, and now my PhD thesis, just to show you that is still valuable to export renewable energy from concentrating solar power plants to Europe as one element of the energy transition in Europe to supplement wind, photovoltaic, biomass and all other energies in Europe, but also for the homegrown energy supply in North Africa. Such an export could help also North Africa just to finance cooperation between the new agricultural use of the area and just to bring new ideas and technology also to North Africa and help also countries that are already building such renewable power plants to finance new projects to use concentrating solar power. So, and I will now show you why such an export is worth, what's the value of this energy export from North Africa to Europe from research point of view. We here at the DLR are using an energy system model which includes all possible energy combinations like the dispatchable energy which is available around the clock from gas, coal, nuclear, but also renewable ones, biomass, geothermal and concentrating solar power, in combination with fluctuating energies, energy that is not always available and just comes when wind is blowing and sun is shining. These are photovoltaics, wind onshore and wind offshore. And also flexibility options to flexibilize the demand and the supply, like the grid and storage and demand side management. These technologies can interplay in a mix of an energy supply system, which we analyze in an complicated energy model. And the target function of this energy model is, of course, to decrease costs or to limit, to minimize costs for a sustainable energy system. Such an analysis was done here in my PhD thesis, which analyzed the value of concentrating solar power for a sustainable electricity supply in Umina in the year 2015. Therefore, we just introduce such an export from concentrating solar power plants here in Middle East and North Africa via point-to-point connections to off-takers in Europe. And we said, okay, if we just introduce this, then we exclude also and show what happens when we just neglect this energy imports or this energy exports from Middle East, North Africa to Europe. The consequence was, as you can see here in this table, that system cost uncertainties, power plant capacity, electricity storage capacity, power kilometer from the grid and all the necessary infrastructure for the energy system, and the grid stress, which just has bottlenecks or high peaks, and the curtailment, the energy waste just increases when concentrating solar power isn't exported from North Africa, Middle East to Europe. That is one novel scientific contribution to use valuable energy from desert power plants for Europe, which is novel and not yet shown, the value of this energy technology. So, how can such a project start on political level now? One option could be the identification of off-takers in Europe. Here you see 4 regions in Europe, like Baden-Württemberg in Germany, Rhône-Alpes in France, Lombardie in Italy, and Catalonia in Spain. These are called the 4 motors of Europe, which build just economic regions, which has the demand of renewable energy and the will also to make an energy transition on low carbon energies. one important country is Morocco. Already said by Felix that NOR 1 was built, and Morocco has the know-how and the potential to use concentrating solar power efficiently and also to export such renewable energy. Therefore, the 4 motors and Morocco can cooperate in a win-win situation. Morocco can get income from these exporting energy, like Germany did for cars. Yeah, and the 4 motors in Europe can profit to supplement their homegrown energy system with this energy that just fulfills the gaps of wind and photovoltaic energy. Therefore, this cooperation could be one possible start option, but it needs political help just to say that there is a will, that there is an off-taker, and that we can make a specific project that is financeable and certain, with guarantees of these regions and countries. Now I will take you on an experimental game which shows the value of a supergrid and of point-to-point connections, which are already shown in the presentation. The initial situation here today in Europe and in North Africa is an existing transmission grid. The transmission grid just has the possibility to balance power between countries, that power plants of one country can fill gaps of other countries, but just to a very low capacity. So the grid is not really strong enough to just to provide, for example, from Spain energy to Russia. That's not really possible because the capacity of the grid is just limited. Therefore, the idea is, what can we do now? We can just build a bigger grid over the existing grid. And that what are we doing now? We are building a supergrid. So, therefore, I have here this supergrid here. And now we will start here at the front in Europe and end in North Africa. Okay. Perhaps Felix, you can help me.
Sure.
And just pay attention to strong networking, so that everybody perhaps is part of the supergrid. Okay?
Okay. So do we connect crisscross or along the front first and then go to the back?
Crisscross is best.
Crisscross. Okay, I'm just gonna throw this. Someone has to catch it and then throw it back.
So, and then I will explain the rest. Here in Europe, two centers of demand
You have to hold onto it.
are defined. These centers of demand have an electricity demand. Okay, who will play one center in Europe, a center of demand here in the front side? Okay, you? Okay, just put on.
Just wanted to get the hat.
Okay, and another one? Yeah, okay, yeah, front side, okay.
So these centers would essentially be big cities.
Yeah, these centers, for example, would be Brussels or London. Okay, London? And Paris?
For example.
Paris, okay. London and Paris. So, besides these centers, there are backup power plants, gas and coal-fired power plants, which are just working in case that no electricity is there. And in North Africa, on the backside, 2 solar thermal power plants, 2 concentrating solar power plants are defined. Who wants to play a concentrating solar power plant in the backside? Okay. You will also get 1 electron. Perhaps you can just give the electron to 1 concentrating solar power plant and another one. Another one, okay. And another one. So, to the backside. Concentrating solar power plants. I don't know where the grid is ending now.
It's there. Polina's the end.
Okay. Super. So supergrid is done, finished. And now the centers of demand say, oh, I have demand of electricity. and the solar thermal power plants try just to deliver the electron through the supergrid to the centers of demand. And you just put it into the supergrid and demand center is not okay. Demand center should be part of the grid. Okay. So, and now we just one participant just measures the time that is needed for the electron to be transmitted. Sure, super. To be transmitted to the center of demand. When the electron is leaving the supergrid in an urgent case, then it has to be restarted. Okay? So then we just start now, and the electron moves from the concentrating solar power plant to the center of demand.
Sí, este es un electrón y este electrón que tiene que mover.
Put it there.
Okay, and time starts now. Yeah? And you just help to make the electron. Okay. Super, super. Very nice. So it's leaving, then it has to be restarted.
It drops and goes back really good.
No, pero tú no.
Let's go.
Okay, really good. One electron. Okay, stop the time. And how many seconds did you need?
For the other
For
electron,
one, yeah?
that was 19 seconds.
19 seconds. Okay, we remember this. Okay.
19,
And
right?
19, yeah?
T.
19?
Of course. Yeah, yeah.
19, okay. 19.
19.
Yeah, at those
Okay, so only one.
92.5 minutes.
Okay, only London now.
We only have one
Yes,
scientist in the room.
only London got the electrons, and Paris did not get anyone.
Oh, sorry. I have two electrons.
So the backup power plant, the gas power plant near Paris, just gives the electron to the demand center. Okay, you remember the situation? Now we just deconstruct the supergrid and put it all together for later analysis. Okay?
So
Just collect it. Yeah.
Do I have you collected?
Come back.
Just rock the supergrid a little bit. So, and now we are making point-to-point connections. This looks like this. Now the solar thermal power plant just gets one connection. Felix, you can throw better than.
Let's see about that.
So, and the connection ends.
I think I threw too much.
And the connection ends at the center of demand in Europe.
There.
Okay, so just keep it and okay. And another one.
Why don't you throw this time?
It's just here. You can just give it. And another solar thermal power plant. Okay.
yes.
Yeah. And the center of demand here. So, and then just keep it strengthened. Yeah. No, like this.
Oops.
Okay. And now the centers of demand just announce, hey, I've got a demand. And then the electron moves. Oh, we just cut it, for example. Yeah. Just cut it here. Okay.
Are you gonna throw the knife?
No. Can you just cut?
think it would be faster if you threw the knife.
Faster but not accurate enough.
Okay, thank you. So, and then we stop the time again. Who will stop the time? And then the electrons move from the solar thermal power plants directly to the centers of demand. And we start now. Now the electrons move. Fast. Super, stop now. How many seconds did they need?
15.
15 seconds.
10 seconds.
So 10 seconds compared to 19 or 90 seconds. So we can see the difference. The point-to-point connections are just easier at the beginning to supply the centers of demand than a high supergrid. Because these point-to-point connections can build specific business cases as a closed project with the solar thermal power plant, the transmission line and the off-taker, and therefore can be financed, can be planned as an enclosed project. The supergrid, as you can see, many participants are involved.
Yes.
And a supergrid can be still possible with the connection of point-to-point lines in the future. But at the beginning, certain projects are needed just to finance, to build concentrating solar power plants for the centers of demand. Also centers of demand in North Africa can participate. So Europe fears this idea because it has got many uncertainties in the political mind, and these uncertainties just have to be explained clearly with the value of such concentrating solar power, which is dispatchable and not available in Europe and can supplement the European energy portfolio with diversification of renewable and dispatchable power in Europe. What you can do now is that you can talk to your politicians in EU member states, because only EU member states, they decide about their energy portfolio. The EU is also one framework, but the member states are important for this. And therefore you can just say, okay, there's an idea, you can import, or you can make cooperation with North Africa, Middle East to import valuable and sensible energy, just as one part of the energy transition in Europe. What we need in the scientific point of view is a specific pilot study to analyze where the transmission line just is going along, where are the places for the concentrating solar power plants, how much money must be spent. We know about some numbers, but a specification now is urgently needed just to make a realization possible. Therefore we need money, of course, and yeah. Thank you for your cooperation, building a supergrid. Perhaps we can work closer together worldwide on the world's desert. Yumina was also only an example. Also other desert areas can be possible to cooperate, of course. As you want, some literature is also available, and I will publish also this presentation later on the internet, and you can find it with the title A Virtual Journey to Deserts. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Dennis.
You're welcome.
Do we have any questions for Dennis? Right there.
I was hoping you could clarify if there are specific reasons why the EU states aren't interested in building.
Yes, of course. The politicians don't know about the value of this energy. for the energy transition because it must be explained from system analytic point of view, not from technology point of view. It must be explained that it's valuable for the whole energy system, and of course the research results are very novel, that the value is clarified for this. Later we had got big ideas and we said, okay, it must be valuable, but now we have got specific arguments to convince that this energy is possible, is feasible to be transmitted to Europe. And in Europe, politicians, they fear. As you can see, Europe drives more to the right side and wants to be more national and don't want to be more interconnected, more in cooperation, even above or abroad. They just want to make their own soup. They don't want to cooperate.
And I think in addition to that, there's another important factor, that there's obviously domestic interests within these European countries. All these European countries have large utility companies that currently profit of selling their nuclear, their coal, their traditional energy sources to the population. And it's not in their interest to have a competition from desert energy to come in. So these are also interests we have to fight in convincing European governments to allow import of desert energy. Yep.
Some minutes ago you showed a study that you carried out about the pros and cons of implementing a supergrid, like it was a table. And the comparison is made showing, yes, the right side is with the current system or with a future system.
It's a future, it's a future system in 2050, and it just analyzes what happens if we include this technology, this point-to-point CSP, HVDC line to the center of demand, and without such configuration. It's not a supergrid, it's just a point-to-point connection. And this case just analyzes the pros and cons, and it's a technology assessment of this additional technology, which is just one part of the energy system, and it's a part of a diversification, of course, and of a higher degree of freedom, that we can just configure our energy system with this technology option. And this is the result from my PhD thesis, that it is valuable and it can supply energy from MENA to Europe sensibly.
Okay, because I was wondering, a supergrid means lots of investment, also losses for transmission lines.
Yeah.
But then you can also invest all this money in a production of electricity that could be more local, and also to find ways of trading this electricity among, I don't know.
Sure.
So for example, a smart grid that is more local. So did you implement a possible, future in the right side with a better implementation of all the current technologies that are well developed but are not implemented still? Like the comparison is made. Did you understand?
And perhaps for the explanation, we made this game just to compare the supergrid, which is shown here, to the point-to-point connections. A supergrid can be built one day, but at the start it's not really sensibly just to include all the participations in around MENA, because some countries are interested and some not. We can just say that a start of some point-to-point connections from CSP, HVDC is sensible. And to your question, as I've shown here, we have an energy system model that includes all kind of technologies, also smart grids, local grids. And we can see that an import from CSP just reduces the grid effort we have to do here in Germany or in Europe with this additional technology. Because wind and photovoltaic just increase a higher grid demand in Europe. And if we just include an export or an import from North Africa, the Middle East to Europe, then the grid demand here in Europe just decrease. So therefore it's a value of this technology, as you can see here. It's called nodal grid power kilometers, what you mentioned. And these power kilometers just are lower than without this technology.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah?
First of all, thanks for your great presentation. Enjoyed it a lot. One concern that came to my mind about the high voltage direct current lines was, I was interested in your opinion on whether you might run into local resistance, because I was thinking that if I think about Bavaria, for example, we had the discussion about these particular lines, and the result was that we're now taking these lines underground, which makes the whole installation more expensive and so on, blah blah blah. So what's your stance on that?
Well, as a sensitivity analysis, we also included underground cables in this case. And I think it must be a civil project which is decentralized by civil people that can decide whether it's an overhead line or underground cable and where the cable is going along. And they must earn money from this cable because electricity is flowing under their ground, for example. And therefore, people have to benefit from this cable. They just should have the opinion, I want this cable because I'm part of an international cooperative and I can earn money, or I can be, it can be beneficial for myself. Otherwise, it's very complicated, and I agree with your opinion. Very good question. Yes.
Yep, the jacket, yeah.
Thank you, sir, for your great presentation. I'm from Algeria. I want to ask you something about Desertec. They had, in the past years, I think 2007 or 2009, they had one of the most prominent projects they had in our desert in a region called Ain Salah, which is the most sun-radiated maybe region, but the project has been killed. I don't know if who killed it, Algerian government or Desertec, and why?
See over the year. So just in any case, in urgent cases, that's a possibility to run still the power plant, which is still warm, and you can just use the biomass, for example, from the agricultural sites around the concentrating solar power plants, which are perhaps then existing from agricultural use.
Okay, so this doesn't apply for the
No.
northern winter or something?
Yeah, for winter times, yeah, in some hours, but it's really, really small. If it's still needed.
No, I just wondered because in the desert you don't have that much biomass,
sure.
right?
Sure.
Yeah, right there.
I want to return to this colonization thing you hit upon.
Okay.
So we're concerned with people in Northern Europe, like, I don't know the example, but like you said, like want it underground, we don't want these grids. Okay, fine. But then I'm thinking, so we're taking this resource from basically North Africa, much like we would take oil or gold from somewhere. How do we guarantee that this resource that's coming from there, that it benefits the actual people? Because I can imagine that the governments are very interested. It's a new profitable source. How do we ensure that we're not taking away this valuable resource from the actual people living there? I don't know if that's like a calculation, because it now seems like a plan. Great idea, everybody's going to profit, but you know, how do you approach it?
Do you want to answer that from a scientific or more political perspective?
Both, perhaps. If you, should I?
Why don't you start with the science?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the framework, as I mentioned, like the transmission line, should be a civil project. And to guarantee this, of course, you have to implement a strong framework on that. But what happens if we don't use this resource? We just rob the country the resource. If we don't use it, it just stays desert. Of course, North African countries can still implement for local demand such power plants. But with the cooperation in Europe, even new living area can exist with exporting such a valuable energy resource. And the right frame conditions, of course, must be in an agreement of both sides. What happens afterwards with the money, it's hard to control, of course, you're right. But trust is one important cooperation basic for an international project, like in the car industry or in other exporting products.
And I think that's a very important point. And one other thing to consider is obviously there's a right and a wrong way to to implement this. But one of the things we have to consider how it differs from these natural resources you've mentioned is that it's very easy for governments to control natural resources, and that's how they can control the income from those natural resources, often with a negative impact on their citizenship. But the wonderful thing about deserts is that we have so much of it, right? The wonderful thing is that we don't have a limited amount of sun, and that these things can happen in competition. And you don't necessarily need government control to make that possible. So obviously it's very important that we implement this the right way, but I think that there's a smaller likelihood of this having negative impacts on local populations than with natural resources.
It's just, can I react?
Yeah, sure.
It's just that I would say that that's the first condition before you go excited to your politicians say like, you should implement this anyways. And then this should be a first condition, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely agree.
Awesome.
Do we have any other questions? Right there?
One question about the loss of energy during the transmission. How much do you lose? Because it's quite still, even if you make it point to point, quite a long way. And connecting to that, if there is the possibility or the thought about transfer of high energy demand industries to those North African regions, because often those industries go to the energy source where the energy is cheapest and most available, so this would be a possibility.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. The transmission loss of 1,000 kilometers HVDC are between 3 and 5% and really low. So you just lose about or less than 10% over 2,600 kilometers. And the price difference of local demand in North Africa and Europe is not so high. Of course, in North Africa, when prices of concentrating solar power decrease in future, is lower than in Europe, but it's not a high difference. So probably industry can be built in North Africa, but also stay in Europe, of course. Okay.
I've got two small questions. First is it why only limited to North Africa? And I'll let you answer that. I can't remember my second question.
Perhaps show this one. There are many possibilities to cooperate. Here, of course, for Western Europe, the closest transmission pathway could be here, also Northwestern Africa, here, but also for Eastern Europe or parts of Russia, Middle East can be also possible. So it depends whether you want a longer transmission line, more diverse solar resource from different countries. The possibility to trade inside Humina is quite huge. Also to export from North Africa to southern regions here in Middle Africa, it's also possible. Or here from Mexico to northeastern America, to the US, or from Chile here to Argentina, or from the inside of Mongolia to the parts here in China, or to Japan, for example. There are many possibilities.
Where does the actual funding come for the industry? Is it locally or is it part of a whole system?
The funding, what do you mean?
With regards to who's actually going to finance the development of the industry on the ground?
Are you asking about the power plant specifically or the entire system?
Power plant.
I think the issue here isn't the supply, it's the demand. As soon as these countries as soon as Europe opens its or reduces their trade barriers and allows export of electricity into Europe, there won't be an issue with supply because it's going to be financially sensible. It's going to actually make a profit to build these power plants. So as soon as we reduce these regulations and make this possible, I don't think there will be a lack of investment in these kinds of technologies. But these could obviously be local or international investors. Yeah?
Yeah, so you say this is
dispatchable energy, but I wonder what's the capacity or the capacity of the thermal supply at night compared to the direct supply during the day.
Of course, you have an surplus during the day, and the surplus is used depending on the size of the solar field for the thermal storage. It's just the right configuration, but you can say that nearly half of the production, more than half of the production goes into thermal storage and then driving the steam turbine during night. It has a capacity of about 12 to 13 hours that the thermal storage can still be used to provide steam. On the same capacity.
And the same as a nuclear power plant. A nuclear power plant is only doing hot water.
Yeah.
It's the same.
Yeah?
Just a question, how big does a concentrated solar power plant have to be feasible? So how much gigawatt does it have to actually produce to be feasible to actually set up the transmission lines and everything?
As you can see, here are some numbers. We say about 1.5 gigawatt net in Germany or in France or in Europe are a suitable size for a first pilot study, for a first pilot transmission line. Smaller power plants can be used locally, but for the dimensioning of the transmission line, which has to be quite long, the optimal is around 1.5 gigawatt, which substitutes one nuclear power plant in Europe or one big coal power plant to 1-to-1.
Yep.
And if you think of this in terms of space, like how much square meters or something would have to be covered to replace one nuclear power plant in Europe?
For the demand for all European countries, including also some geographical regions in Russia, which belong to geographical Europe, it's about the size of Switzerland, which is quite small compared to the huge area that we have in the North African desert. And the same size is about, for the local use in Middle East, can be around the same size. And therefore we can say, as Friedhof Finkbeiner said, just one mirror for Middle East and North Africa, one mirror for Europe. So it's a cooperation on same level.
Yeah?
Is there still time? Perhaps one more question.
Sure.
Could you say a few more words on, you were talking about the renaturation or the possibility to integrate agriculture and renaturate land in the desert, and I was wondering how, whether that's feasible resource-wise, in terms of how much energy do you have to put into this renaturation in comparison to doing agriculture elsewhere, where it's more, where the conditions are better.
For example, as you can see here, there is construction of a water pipeline. In the case of Morocco, it's about 400 kilometers from the sea level to one power plant station, which is quite long. So the investment is high, but compared to the electricity price, it's really, really low, above 1 cent per kilowatt hour. And the total price here for the power plant, including transmission line, converters and pipeline, is about 12 to 15 euro cent per kilowatt hour. So that's our calculation around. It's an investment of about 15 to 17 billion euros. But for the kilowatt hours, really comparable low. And the energy demand for water desalination, to bring sustainable water from Mediterranean Sea or the Atlantic coast here in Morocco to the desert areas, it's about 0.3% of the capacity of the solar thermal power plant. so it's neglectable. It's really slow, it's really low that you can just say. What we need is a biomass at first, just to have a ground, a basic, to build the trees that must be put there, and then the wastewater for cleaning the mirrors, for example, can be used for the agricultural plants or
Fatou?
Yes. I just want to ask a question, and then I'll just have to throw more light on what Felix said in the beginning. That most African countries actually think that because we were colonized by the Europeans, that if we do business with them, they are going to exploit or loot our economy, or our resources per se. So, like with this project, I believe it's a very great vision, and that if it's implemented, it's going to yield success. But how far have you tried to engage the necessary stakeholders in this project, especially government, like the governments of the targeted African countries that you want to do the business with? So how far have you tried to engage them, bring them on board, and then,
That's a very good question. I think what's important to emphasize here is that we're just in the process of taking over the Desertec initiative, right? So we are at the very beginning and starting a new chapter, which allows for all of these kinds of engagements. But I think, as we mentioned before, the Moroccan government is a lovely example that shows that local governments are very enthusiastic about making that happen. So naturally, it's very, very important that we engage with them. But I don't think that's going to be any issue. I don't think there's going to be any lack of enthusiasm on the side of African countries on making these things happen. In fact, I think it's one of the biggest demands that most African countries have at World Trade Organization conferences, is to decrease trade barriers by Europe to allow for the export of African resources and African products. And I think this would be one of such ideal products for African countries to export. Yeah?
Yeah. I'm wondering who are going to be the actors who are going to implement this. Because you mentioned a couple of times, well, there's a lot of interest and maybe yeah, it will go its way, but do you have specific businesses, like for instance, who is going to implement this? Are it going to be European businesses, are it going to be African businesses? How do you know if they are willing to create this project?
I think what has to happen is a three-step process. The first step is we lobby European governments to allow the import of electricity. That's step one. Step two is that we create model projects or model calculations, as Denis has already done, and yeah, create suggested projects. And as soon as these are set up as corporations, what you then do with some good business leaders together, you start collecting investments. Mostly these kinds of projects are obviously not funded by one single donor or funder, but rather by multiple smaller investors that all join in and together form a corporation that will then build such a transition line. So I think the first step has to be to make this politically feasible by reducing these trade barriers, and then once you set up one model project and it's successful, I think the rest will then start replicating itself as soon as it makes money. Yeah?
For example, in Germany, we burn coal. For more than 25% of our electricity, we burn coal in Germany. Because we have a lot of utilities and we have a very good lobbying. They do a very good job that we better burn coal instead of investing or open the barriers for just a line. And if the political barrier is open, if it's allowed to export, the African countries export energy, there's enough money on this planet that a lot of people would invest immediately in these solar power plants. It's just a problem of lobbying. Yeah, this is the key. The key is we have to open the market in Europe to get and from the European Charter, it's allowed. From the law, it's allowed. But there's no interest of German or European companies to open the market.
Could you build a little bit more on the barriers that you're facing in implementing this project?
As a first step, of course, you need to search an off-taker, which just takes this electricity off and has the intention, okay, I need this electricity to supplement my energy portfolio. Then you have to get guarantees for the investment. The investment are quite huge. So the interest must be low, that the overall costs rest low. Therefore you need guarantees, like from the World Bank, or that just guarantee you a AAA state. Then you have to search for a suitable place in North Africa. Then the transmission line can be from the concentrating solar power plant to the off-taker, which has the intention.
Yeah, okay.
But therefore you already need the feasibility studies. Feasibility studies are essential to prove if some pathways are really feasible, that the countries, the transmission countries, perhaps can also profit from a separate transmission line which goes to their countries. Therefore, many barriers are still open, which are just accrue in a feasibility study. We still don't know every barrier, but some barriers we can just imagine. But a specific feasibility study is needed. Therefore, thanks for your question.
I think this is probably a good time to end the discussion, but Dennis, you're going to be here for quite a while, right?
Yes.
So we can all chat with Dennis later and ask him all the questions directly. Two last things. First of all, we have these books, the Desertic Atlas. So if you're interested in reading more, you can pick up one as you leave. And the second thing is that obviously we're trying to start this project again, and we need a lot of help to make that possible. So if you're interested in helping us as we figure out how to best approach this project, it would be great if you could come up here and maybe write down your name on this piece of paper right there. And then we will, talk to you how we can work together to make this happen. Thank you.